Welcome, everyone. We are going to look at section 1 of our new unit called Patterns of Inheritance, and we are going to look at the work or the scientific investigation that a guy by the name of Gregor Mendel did. Gregor Mendel is often referred to as the father of modern genetics, and we'll kind of take a look at what he did and how he came up with his ideas. So prior to Mendel, this is before Mendel's work, plant and animal breeders had many questions about how things are passed on from one generation to the next. We talk about inheritance, and that's what we're talking about, generation to generation, how traits get passed on. For a long time, all they could do was really make observations. But their observations didn't always answer all the questions that they had. And then this guy, Gregor Mendel, who was an Austrian monk, so he was studying to be a priest, or was a priest, I guess, he came up with a series of experiments that he went and he looked into kind of explain how things get passed on from one generation to the next, or to explain these patterns of inheritance. So prior to Mendel, there was this idea called the blending hypothesis of inheritance. So think of it exactly like that. If you were to take two different things, like a red flower and a white flower, and you were to put them in a blender, what would you get? We'd get a pink flower, right? We blend these two traits to get that. That's the idea of a blending hypothesis. If your mom is tall and your dad is short, you're going to be kind of in between them. That's that idea of the blending hypothesis. Not correct, not valid, but that's the idea. That's what was thought to have been the case. So in the blending hypothesis, we have to kind of first start by defining what a trait is. So a trait is a variation of a particular character or characteristic. So when we're talking about a trait, we're talking about like a red flower, a white flower. Those are the traits that we're looking at. So for example, one plant might have a trait for red flowers, while another might have a trait for a white flower. Those are the two traits. Now, according to the blending hypothesis, red and white blended together will give us pink. Okay, but that's not always going to be the case. In the early 1800s, biologists posed the blending hypothesis to explain how these traits get passed on to new generations. So it works in some cases, but it doesn't always work. So the blending hypothesis assumed that when two parents came together, their offspring would be a perfect mix of them. A perfect mix. So that means you are perfectly a mix between your mom and your dad, and you don't look more like your mom than your dad. Again, not true to this day, but this is important in the process of how we got to where we are today. So in the different example of flowers, a red flower and a yellow flower should always produce an orange flower. However, this isn't always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. And what we'd see is that some of these traits would disappear for an entire generation and then just kind of pop up later. So if we take blue water and yellow water, we should get green water. That's true. But what this is saying is if we went yellow and blue and we get green, from green and green, if we did like the next generation, we should only ever get green, but sometimes we'd get this yellow or a blue popping back out, and that's not really how you can't just magically pull yellow water out of green water. So Gregor Mendel, and we're talking now the 1800s, okay? So this is still a really long time ago. Gregor Mendel, again, Austrian monk, he was a teacher, he studied math, he studied science, and he was fascinated by sexually reproducing organisms, specifically plants, and how they pass on traits from one generation to the next. Now, he studied pea plants, and it's very convenient that he studied pea plants because pea plants are like this perfect kind of organism in terms of how they pass traits on. We are not nearly as perfect in terms of how traits are passed on. We really oversimplify things when we do this unit. We talk about one trait has one gene, and that's not really the case. For example, your hair color is influenced by many different genes and many different traits. So this idea, though, in sexually reproducing organisms, plants sexually reproduce, most of them, that we get this male and female sex cells joined together to fertilize, and we get this we restore the diploid number was the phrase we used. So when these flowers are pollinated, that's sexual reproduction, and that's what happens in pea plants. So Mendel was one of the first scientists to apply an experimental approach to discover how these traits were really passed on. How did a purple flower and a white flower create a purple flower? And then what happens when we took this purple flower and we crossed it with another purple flower that was in that generation? Well, we'd get this kind of weird mixing of purples and whites. So his work eventually created this field called genetics that we know of today. But basically what we're doing is just talking about how things are inherited from one generation to the next. So Mendel went and he bred these pea plants for years and years, and he recorded what the offspring of all of his different crosses. Now, when we talk about crosses, what we're talking about is when we take a purple flower and a white flower and we cross it, we're fertilizing them. We're letting them sexually reproduce. That's what a cross is. So Mendel's discoveries, he found that the parent plants pass on genes that are responsible for inherited traits. And remember, a gene, we talked about this in cell division, mitosis, meiosis, it's a chunk of DNA that codes for a particular trait. Okay, so it's a segment of DNA, it's a location on a chromosome. He stressed that genes are not being blended, but that they have their own identity. Okay, so Mendel said, blending hypothesis, not true. So he started with what we referred to as true breeding plants. So we use these letters. We often talk about big A's and little a's and little a's. So we use capital and lowercase letters to represent different alleles, different traits. But what he first had to do is he started with something that he called true breeding. He wanted his pea plants that he was using to only have a trait that could possibly be passed on. Okay, so he produced these identical plants to the parents. The plants were purple with purple flowers, produced new plants with only purple flowers. And then these plants were allowed to self-fertilize. So he took the pollen and he fertilized the flower, and he went to great measures to make sure there was no cross fertilization. He covered these things with cheesecloth or a bag or a screen that would not prevent that pollen from crossing from one to the next. So he would only self-pollinate. So he took this flower and he pollinated with itself, and then he took this flower and he pollinated it with itself. So he got these things that he referred to as true breeding plants. Then once he had a crop of these true breeding plants, he started to cross-fertilize or cross plants with different traits. So he would go through and he'd take, say, this white flower and this purple flower, and he would cross them. But to prevent this, again, he went to measures and he cut off all the parts that would produce the pollen. So therefore, there was no way that purple flower could self-pollinate. Okay, there was no way that could self-pollinate. So then he would manually take the pollen from the white and fertilize the purple. The offspring from Mendel's crosses did not follow the blending hypothesis. Okay, they did not. So then what he concluded was that the biological inheritance is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next. Chemical factors known as genes, again, we've used that term a bunch, produce different characteristics for each trait. Each trait was controlled by a gene that had two contrasting forms. These different forms are called alleles, and we've used that term alleles too. So he came up with these conclusions based upon his observations. So we are going to start looking at things called Punnett squares. We probably did one in class already before you watched this video. But the idea is if we take this allele, a big B, and we take this allele, a little b, and we take this allele, big B, and we take this allele, little b, and we cross them, then what we can do is we can create these Punnett squares that come up with all the possible combinations that this flower could create with this flower. This big B and big B could combine. This big B and little b combine. This big B, little b, or this little b, little b. That's a Punnett square. Now, all this does is it gives us the possible outcomes, but it doesn't guarantee results. So that's where we're kind of heading. Gregor Mendel was huge in importance in this field, and that's why we call him the father of modern genetics. Have a great day.